On this episode of FieldLink, Jody Lawrence joins us from Nashville to discuss the commodity markets. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. And welcome back to FieldLink. Joining us from Kansas City is Jody Lawrence. Jody, you're on the road today.
Yep, on the road with Helena, doing a West Central and Midwest meeting with growers and a lot of the brain power throughout Helena. I'm honored to be invited to talk. And, you always have markets, and then you get into all the scientific nature of the crop. So these are always interesting times for me to be able to learn things and I already heard the farmers, few of them waiting in line with me to check into my room, that they were talking to one of the agronomists, and they said, wow, we've already learned more than we did at the nutrient deal we went to. So I thought that was pretty funny and a good thing to lead in with. So
there you go. Well, listen, harvest is certainly upon us in certain parts of the country. I know we've got combines starting to roll around here in the Mid-South. Some of my staff was traveling back from Iowa, said, boy, they hit Arkansas, seeing some combines. They're starting to poke out there and open up some fields for sure across the Midwest and rows and so forth. And we're seeing some different things out there. There's been a lot of reports, Southern rust moving up through the Northern Corn Belt, certainly going to potentially impact some yields. But Jody, how is some of this news, along with all of the global news, starting to impact grain markets?
Well, today was a very interesting day because we came out last Friday, the Friday before Labor Day, with a lot of optimism in the new crop markets in both corn and beans, because you had a Chinese trade delegation that was still in Washington in discussions and apparent negotiations about trade bills and other things. And the history shows that if the Chinese go to the trouble to send a trade delegation, they will at least make some good faith or some olive branch type purchases, whether it's beans or corn or something large enough that it definitely shows up on the scale. But unfortunately, they left after the markets closed on Friday with no signed contracts and no indications that they were going to come back this week to clean up anything. And so that was frustrating. And beans gave back everything that they gained on Friday of last week on Tuesday's trade. But corn had a really good looking day because it went down, tested technical support, and early this morning it looked like corn was going to fall back under and be in some trouble, but it rallied through the rest of the day, and it closed at a new, since July 21st. So,
wow,
pushing 6 weeks of highs, and then the high that week, the high for most of July. Let's see, that was, we're getting back up into those 425 to 435 areas that we thought we could get to. The good news, it's kind of a good news, bad news scenario. We've got rallies in corn because the demand is staying really good for old crop, but we have a rally in corn because it's excessively dry, really, really dry August for a majority of the Eastern Corn Belt. And I've talked to a lot of producers who have already written off their top end expectations that they had a month, 5-6 weeks ago. And then you get into who was right. It was the USDA right with 188.3, was Pro Farmer right with their 184. Is it somewhere in the middle like all of these things usually do? And what could possibly happen if it doesn't rain anymore? Because then you're caught with, well, we were hoping the extra bushels would make up for the difference in this, but then all of a sudden we're on the verge of a 35-cent rally since the middle of August, and you kind of have to weigh all this together to figure out what's going to happen, because we've certainly over the last 5 years, and even going back to 17, 18, we've ended up with quite a few dry Augusts that have taken out a lot of the really highest expectations. So it's going to be curious to watch, but I am I'm glad corn has rallied what it has, and I think it's got a little more upside to it. But it is still frustrating that we're talking about a rally to 430 corn to get excited about.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. We're seeing the rally here. The drought, or it's getting drier conditions. That eastern corn belt, boy, they could certainly use some moisture here in the final stretch. On the flip side, too, I was on the Pro Farmer Tour parts of that, and boy, a lot of talk about, southern rust coming in, coupled with, tar spot, northern blight. Boy, just a lot of compelling things that could be stacking up against us in terms of yield. That could certainly impact some of those numbers that were certainly reported from Pro Farmer.
Yeah, it's just always when you start talking about such a record jump from a record yield last year, even though we have to remember that it got trimmed from the initial August until the January final. So this is really a very similar tale. It comes about if you're going to have a monster crop, weather has to be perfect or darn close to it from the time it goes in the ground until the time it hits black layer on corn, and until the leaves start falling off on beans. And we're just not seeing that again this year. So how much do we take off? I think this is going to be a great test run for all of the seed companies and everyone who goes out. And when they get all of their plot tests and their new yield variety corn harvested and say, hey, this variety yielded better, in the end of season drought than this one did. So it's always a learning time for everybody in the business, and this year presents us another opportunity with the dry eastern corn belt.
Yep. Kind of coupled with that dry eastern corn belt, some early indicators pointing towards, moisture, and the Ohio River being a little bit drier, certainly going to impact those tributaries into the Mississippi. We could potentially see some more struggles this fall at harvest time during a critical time for, logistics on the river.
Yeah, it becomes a two-pronged problem because basis levels start to fall as the load capacity of the barges gets cut because of low water levels. And then you think what those barges are hauling down, just the Mississippi, let's say they're going all the way to New Orleans, they're picking up something for the fall application, whatever it is, potash, nitrogen, whatever they're picking up. And then you start to have the supply dislocations that we've seen several years. It's not going to be, the river's not as low yet as it has been the past couple Augusts, but we saw the kind of the long ranging part of that. It's just hard to get the logistics straightened out when you can't get out or bring back in the right tonnages of things to when the crop is harvested and then when you start preparing for the 26 crop.
Yep, definitely something to keep an eye on here over the next several weeks, monitoring that weather pattern there and how it's going to impact the river. Okay, Jody, let's circle back a little bit back to soybeans. We talked about the Chinese. They came to town, but no orders. What are we seeing from the impact of that right now?
Really, and I think another event happened this weekend that plays into all of this. But what we're seeing is without Chinese demand, our soybean domestic stocks are going to be enormous because they usually account for, in the really good years, nearly 1 billion bushels, but on a normal year, 400 to 500 million. And if they now have a direct pipeline to get everything they need from Brazil, I think we have gotten to the point where we're just going to have to figure out what to do if China buys no beans from the U.S. And along that, you have to start talking about sustainable aviation fuel and the biofuel markets that we have talked about on other episodes. But one of the things that really does concern me, because over the years, we've talked about the BRIC alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. All of those leaders were in Beijing over the weekend and other of their allies, China's allies, and they all looked awfully happy. And when you start thinking that all of our adversaries are getting together to, I don't know about plot, if that's the right word, but they're certainly all together and their representatives are together. And, for those, the big one that concerns me the most is not Brazil and China, because we know what we've had there. It's been like that for several decades, but it becomes India, because we thought that India would be a place where we could get more export demand,
Right.
that they would be a better customer. But it looks like right now, in between the trade negotiations, the increased tariffs, that they are leaning on the side of their neighbors, which when you share a border with China and Russia, it's probably good policy to be, be in good standing with both your neighbors when they're nuclear powers. So that's the biggest thing this weekend that concerns me, because if China doesn't buy any beans, it's going to be really hard in the short term to use up the amount that they usually take.
Yeah, definitely going to put a lot of pressure on us domestically to come up with solutions for that stock, not just today, but really potentially long term.
Yeah, exactly. This isn't what do we do about the 25 crop to get it out of here? We have to start thinking about 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, because ethanol, continues to grow, although it's plateauing a little bit. That was a program that was started almost 30 years ago. And we are certainly grateful in the industry that ethanol is there, but our alternatives to Chinese demand, you have to start them at some time, because it's not just something that appears overnight and can, eat and use 500 million bushels of beans.
You bet. Jody, let's pivot a little bit to the bright spot in agriculture, the cattle market. What's going on with the cattle side of the business?
It's really just it's so incredibly impressive what's going on there. It's new all-time high in feeders and fats just about every week. We haven't missed too many weeks where we haven't, and a lot of them we're having them on consecutive days. You have cash trades at levels no one's ever seen before, in the mid 240s. And if you look closely, the markets tried to break for a very short period of time when the case of screwworm showed up in the International Traveler in Maryland, but we've regained all that and added more. The one thing that I have out there, if somebody is looking, hey, there are always two questions: what's going to keep the cattle market rising, and what could possibly put in the top? The things that are going to continue to make it rise are the things that have made it rise to this point. Not replenishing the herd in just a massive way, having a shortage of feeders and less on feed, a high stock market, and good consumer sentiment that, hey, I'm comfortable that my job is secure, all of my investments are doing well, so I don't mind paying a couple more, dollars for the best choices of meat, or for any of the meat that I'm getting, because it's going all through, your best steak all the way down to your hamburger. So that's the thing right now. It would take something on the economic employment side to start to chip away at that, or the other thing that it just depends on trade negotiation is going to be if we begin to import large amounts of feeder cattle from Brazil, that easily could put a top in it. And we're still in negotiations, trade negotiations with tariffs on with them. So that could be a very pivotal kind of negotiation for the cattle market.
Yeah, when you turn the news on and you hear about the amount of energy right now around healthier diets, and beef and meat is certainly a part of those conversations, with Mr. Kennedy really pushing that initiative. And I don't see the consumption side of things going away at all. And really, the U.S. consumer continues to set records in terms of beef consumption.
Yeah, and you look back through the history of cattle scares, and we can go back, because I remember, the only reason I remember it because it was on a Christmas Eve, and this was probably, 25 years, maybe even a few more than that. that the first case of mad cow showed up in the United States, and cattle were limit down. The short trading session on the 24th, and then we came back after Christmas. But within a week, they were back, and within 2 weeks, they were higher than where they were. The U.S. consumer and the U.S. diet is so beef. I wouldn't say dependent, but it's certainly a cornerstone of almost every household food list that I don't see it going away. There are going to be ups and downs in it, but even with the Kennedy, and everything else, and if he decides to go, I don't know how you go non-GMO with cattle and what you wouldn't treat them with or what you wouldn't feed them. But you thought you had high prices. Now, if we ended up having something like that, the price of beef would go through the roof even further than it has.
Yeah. And I mean, just this weekend, I went to Costco with my wife. We were going through the beef area, and it is amazing when you start reading labels to see how much beef is actually being imported today from Brazil. So, which leads me to believe there's got to be some leverage here as we talk about soybean markets and we talk about the beef market and tariffs. Boy, I would think, as one of the largest consumers in the globe for these types of products, we should have a little bit of leverage on our hands.
Yes, I agree. It will be an interesting, this isn't just something that gets wrapped up by the end of the year. This is going to be a multi-year, kind of consumer class on how all of this demand and trade negotiation is worked out.
Yep. A lot of happening in Washington right now in that area for sure right now. So, Jody, want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink. Good luck in Kansas City, and look forward to catching up soon.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Always good to be on.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to subscribe to the FieldLink podcast so you don't miss an episode of the latest in agriculture news, markets, and products that help feed, fuel, and clothe our nation.